Earlier this year, Elon shared a post about trans sex offenders that I thought would be great material for a lesson on the lies we can tell with statistics. We'll take a look at it, and at the end, we'll create our own true lie together. Before we get to it, a bit about my background. While studying for my bachelor's and master's degrees in finance, I took quite a few statistics and data analytics courses, and to my surprise, I actually enjoyed the discipline much more than I expected. It's certainly among the most practically useful forms of mathematics that I've learned. As a disclaimer, I like to say I'm not accusing Elon of intentionally spreading lies. He may honestly believe them just like many of his followers. Also, I ask you to leave your political views on the trans issue aside while we discuss the numbers. The old saying exists for a reason. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. To be fair to Elon, he didn't create the data, he was just sharing the data. From end wokeness, think of that what you may. Sex offenders per million. Biological women, 3. Biological men, 395. Trans women, 1,916. I scrolled through the comments to get some common reactions to this data. We see, make mental asylums great again, and they wonder why we don't want them in women's restrooms. So let's go back to Elon's post. Take a moment for yourself and think about what this data indicates. What are your key takeaways? If you need more time, feel free to pause the video. In no particular order, I'm going to go through my takeaways. The most obvious thing is the largest number belongs to trans women. The trans rate is 1,900 per million, and the rate for biological males is 400 per million. So trans is about 5 times worse. But hold on, there's another figure. Biological women. That number is an infinitesimal 3 per million. How does that compare to biological men? Well, biological men are over 100 times worse than biological women. Trans women are only 5 times worse than biological men. This takeaway is something almost no one notices, perhaps no one cares about. Suppose instead the rate for men were 4 compared to women's 3. Going from 3 to 4 is a 33% increase. That alone would be a substantial, meaningful increase. But we're not going from 3 to 4. We're going from 3 to almost 400, over a 10,000% increase. The jump between women and men is 20 times bigger than the jump between men and trans women. By 20 times bigger, I'm comparing over 100 times to 5 times. My point is, the vast majority of the problem is explained by being male. Now, since half the population is male, and the other half knows plenty of good men, we're not very interested in drawing any men are bad conclusions from this data. If hypothetically someone were to make the case that men are bad, since we're over 100 times more likely to be sexual predators than women, what would be our defense of men? The best defense would be, sure, we're 100 times more likely, but the vast majority of men still aren't sexual predators. This brings me to the second takeaway I've noticed. Everyone sees the comparison, which number is the highest. But what is the total rate we're discussing? Men are over 100 times worse than women, but if the rate for women were 2%, the rate for men would have to be over 200%, which makes no sense. These numbers are a rate per million. The biological woman rate of 3 per million is practically 0. The male rate of almost 400 per million is a 100 times larger number that is still near 0. And the trans rate of 1,900 per million is a 5 times larger number that is also still near 0. For reference, 1% of 1 million is 10,000. So the trans rate is less than a fifth of 1%. The biological male rate is 0.04%, again, 0.04%, and the biological female rate is 0.0003%. So if we're talking numbers as low as 0.00 something percent, we can be 100 times bigger and still be closer to 0% than 1%. So we can successfully defend men by saying, sure, we're 100 times more likely, but well over 99% of us aren't sex offenders, so don't generalize. Instead of looking at the percentage who are sex offenders, we can look at the percentage who aren't. Here are the numbers. Well over 99.99% of women are not sex offenders. 99.96% of men are not sex offenders. And 99.8% of trans women are not sex offenders. When looking at the people who are innocent with respect to sex offenses, the difference between men and trans women is only 0.16%, 99.96 versus 99.8. Here's a chart with the rates of people who are not sex offenders. Can you tell the difference? I can't. I believe I found the source of the data from Elon's post. It was data from the UK, comparing the total population of men, women, and trans women to the number of sex offenders in those respective categories. Again, we're talking rates per million. Well, how many million trans people do you think are in the UK? 5 million? 10 million? The right answer is there are 0 million. How many 100,000 trans people are there? 500,000? 800,000? The right answer again is 0 100,000. There are less than 50,000 trans people in this data set. A grand total of 92 of them are sex offenders. But wait, I thought there were 1,900 trans sex offenders. The 1,900 figure is the statistical result of normalizing the data set to compare rates per million against each other when you have far fewer than 1 million trans people. In other words, over 90% of those 1,900 trans people per million do not exist because there aren't close to 1 million trans people in this data set. There are almost 30 million men in the data set, and for each million of them, there are 395 real sex offenders. There are only 92 total trans sex offenders in the underlying data. The 1916 figure is a hypothetical number based on statistical normalization. This truth illuminates the small scale of the trans issue. Even if it takes up a lot of political advertising dollars, there simply aren't that many trans people in reality. If you look at the total number of real sex offenders in this data set, for women, there are 103 real offenders out of 30.4 million. For men, there are 11,660 real offenders out of 29.5 million. And for trans women, there are 92 real offenders out of 48,000. In Elon's original post, it looks like society is being overrun by trans sex predators. In terms of real sex offenders in the data set, there are slightly more women than trans women, and men are off the charts in comparison. This is reality. These are the real people who are sex offenders in the UK. Same data, but with this statistical perspective, it looks quite different, doesn't it? This is why you have to be careful with statistics. Someone who understands statistics can decide to present things in different ways depending on what they want your takeaway to be, all while remaining technically true. So, let's create a true lie together. Suppose there is a unique name, Branton, like Brandon but with a T. Let's assume there are 100 people in the UK named Branton, and one of them is a sex offender, a rate of 1%. Now I could say, well, per million people named Branton, 10,000 of them are sex offenders. See, the UK is being overrun by sex offenders named Branton. Actually is one real guy, but statistically, if the rate stayed the same, there would be 10,000 of them if there were a million Brantons. It's bullshit, but it's statistically true bullshit. And remember, while trans women are the highest number on that post, in terms of real offenders in that data set, trans women have the fewest. What I'd like you to take away is when you're looking at group differences in statistics, being the worst doesn't always mean you're bad. In terms of the rate, the worst is Branton, followed by trans women. The best are biological women. In terms of real life offenders, the worst by far is biological men. The best is Branton at 1, followed by trans women at 92. Most importantly, even the worst rates are 1% or less. That means over 99% of all those groups are not sex offenders. It saddens me to see people generalize sexual predation on the community when that generalization is going to be wrong over 99% of the time. Now, I don't recommend generalizing in general, but if you do, at least have the decency to be over 50% with the success rate for your generalization. Finally, I'd like to say fear is one of the best sales tactics. Unfortunately, we all fall for it from time to time. The rate of sex offenders for Brantons is 5 times worse than the trans rate, but the underlying statistics are practically the same.